This is the first part of the annotations for the passage in Chapter 6 of The Great Gatsby. Let us begin. We finally learn the actual name of J. Gatsby, a name that he had mostly invented from scratch, although it does rhyme somewhat from his real name. You see, we learn in Chapter 6 finally the true backstory of everything that's been going on behind the scenes, all the nonsense that Gatsby has been spitting at Nick and everyone else and all the fakery and all the lies, we finally do find out what his true lore is. Now, the placement of this in chapter 6 is an odd choice because we actually don't know why we know this in chapter 6. We'll learn a little bit later on in the novel. We'll see the scene in the future where this lore is revealed by Gatsby to Nick. And Gatsby kind of feels like he's lost everything and has nothing more to lose and is finally willing to be honest. But we kind of get it misplaced in the sequence of things, which is quite interesting. To find out that his real name is James Gatz. Something about that tells you that he's, not of the upper class, but this is a very working man's kind of name. There's something almost sort of German or Polish about it. And so it kind of reminds us of a lot of people of the sort of Eastern European heritage that changed their first and last names when they immigrated to the United States, or perhaps when they wanted to enter into celebrity status, because there's a fairly strong prejudice against people with an Eastern European last name. There's a feeling that perhaps they're less educated, or they're peasants, or perhaps they're Catholics, or even worse, God forbid, Jewish. And so it makes sense why he would change his name along with many other people who strive for some kind of significance here in the United States, one in which a name is the difference between success and failure. But anyway, his true name, or at least legally, his name is James Gatz. Now, I think it's interesting here that Fitzgerald wants to kind of clarify for us what he means by really. James Gatz, that was really, or at least legally, his name, because it almost makes us think as though Jay Gatsby has been using this new name for so long. It's kind of, he gets confused which one is the real one and which one is the fake one. It reminds us of like the question around Batman and Bruce Wayne, which one of those is actually the mask, which one's the fake and which one is the true. So we get a little clarification here that James Gatz is at least legally his name, if not perhaps in spiritually his real name. Says that he had changed at the age of 17 and at the specific moment that witnessed the beginning of his career, when he saw Dan Cody's yacht drop anchor over the most insidious flat on Lake Superior. Go ahead and highlight the word insidious. It means sort of like evil or threatening or dangerous. And apparently, James Gatz saw this yacht, this millionaire's yacht, owned by a guy named Dan Cody, who had mistakenly or perhaps carelessly anchored over a very dangerous part of the lake. You see, if the wind blows you the wrong direction, it may run you up onto the rocks and then your ship sinks and you die. And Lake Superior, of course, is one of the Great Lakes. So James Gatz is from somewhere in the Midwest, in the North Midwest. It tells us that it was James Gatz who had been loafing along the beach that afternoon in a torn green jersey and a pair of canvas pants, but it was already Jay Gatsby who borrowed a rowboat, pulled out to the Tuolumne, and informed Cody that wind might catch him and break him up in half an hour. I love this long, involved sentence. So it tells us that James Gatz already had this name kind of in pocket, right? He started the row with his old name, and by the time he reached the yacht, he had his new name, his new identity. This didn't just come out of nowhere. He'd been contemplating or anticipating an opportunity just like this. In fact, this is confirmed in the next paragraph. It says, I suppose he'd had the name ready for a long time, even then. His parents were shiftless and unsuccessful farm people, and his imagination had never really accepted them as his parents at all. That's kind of tough, right? That you never accept your parents as your real parents simply because they are blue collar, because they are poor, because they can't really make anything of their lives. This reminds us a little bit of another sort of religious story of a young man with great dreams of significance who doesn't really accept his parents as being his true parents in a way. It reminds us a little bit of the gospel narrative of Jesus, of Mary and Joseph, and are they you my real parents or is my true parent something larger? So the truth was that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his platonic conception of himself. go ahead and circle Platonic conception. This is an allusion, right? This refers to, of course, the Greek philosopher Plato, who essentially argued that the physical things that we see in front of us are not their true form. They're almost like shadows or reflections of another world which lives in the land of ideals. It's like everything which exists in our world is merely just the shadow cast by the real world of ideas in which things are perfect, and thus his Platonic conception of himself is the version of himself that he truly thinks he is, and the one which is perfect and idealized, the one that he wants to be true. So, an allusion here. It goes on to make this comparison to Jesus very explicit. He says, he was the Son of God. I mean, that's another allusion right there that Jesus claims to also be a son of God who doesn't recognize his true parents' parentage or whatever. It says, it was the Son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that. And he must be about his Father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. Beautiful writing here. Another allusion here. When it says he must be about his father's business, this is an allusion to the story of Jesus when he was a young man, where his parents took him to the temple in Jerusalem, a couple days' journey. And when they returned from it, they found that he wasn't amongst the travelers. And so they go back and they spend a whole day rushing, where back? Where is Jesus? And they find him in the temple, sort of debating with the other priests and philosophers about the meaning of the Torah. When they ask, "Where have you been?" he turns to them and says, "Woman, why have you been looking for me? Do you not know I must be about my father's business?" Which, of course, is a way of him communicating that his true father is God or the Spirit, and that preaching in the temple is more his business than that of his father, the carpenter. But then Fitzgerald qualifies that this son of God, this Gatsby, must be about his father's business, but this business is in service of vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. Vast and vulgar, of course, are an alliteration, V and V, but meretricious is an interesting word. I like it a lot. We don't use it that much anymore. And meretricious has kind of like a definition and a connotation. The definition simply is it is something in which business is done or goods are exchanged. I give you something, you give me something in return. But the connotation of it is actually quite more vulgar. It is the type of thing being exchanged is is being exchanged for sex. So meretricious has the connotation of being essentially prostitutional nature, an exchange which is somehow morally compromised. And so this Gatsby, who is the son of God, yes, he must be about his father's business, but unlike Christ, who's about the business of holiness and justice, this one is about the the God that he serves is one of exchange, one of prostitution, one of getting what you want to get and exchanging something for it. And so this kind of develops Gatsby as almost being like an anti-Jesus or a dark Jesus or like a materialist Jesus. He spreads the gospel of getting money and following your dreams and being ambitious and lying if necessary. So anyway, he invented the sort of Jay Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent, and to this conception he was faithful to the end. Right now, it kind of makes sense why the Jay Gatsby that's explained to Nick is just such a collection of nonsensical fantasies. That he is an orphan from a rich family that hunts tigers and paints stuff and gets rubies and is a war hero. It makes sense why he picked this sort of immature backstory, and that is that it reflects exactly the sort of thing that a 17-year-old would think that a perfect person would be. It's kind of like, if when you were younger, you imagine what a millionaire would be like. It's not exactly realistic, but it's vast and it's broad and not particularly sophisticated. Anyway, the difference between him and us, it says, is that Gatsby, like every young man, has big, broad, unrealistic dreams, but he remains faithful to that conception. He's committed to the bit far more than any of the rest of us are. So it says for over a year he'd been beating his way along the south shores of Lake Superior as a clam digger and a salmon fisher and any other capacity that brought him food and bed. And his brown, hardening body lived naturally through the half fierce, half lazy work of bracing days. Interesting, he's a fisherman. Just like, again, maybe not Jesus, but many of Jesus' disciples were said to be fishermen who made their living along the lake, working men, hard men. And it says that he knew women early. we can go ahead and like talk about the subtext here. This kind of reminds me again of like the biblical euphemism of, Abraham knew his wife. It basically means, to have relations with them, to have physical relations with them. And so it says that he knew them early, which means that he had physical contact with women, right pretty early in his life. And since they spoiled him, he became contemptuous of them. Not a lot of respect for women because, I mean, he's a handsome gentleman and they seem to sort of throw themselves at him. He's contemptuous of women, specifically of young virgins, because they're ignorant, of young ladies who don't seem to know as much as he thinks that they should. But he's also contemptuous of the others, meaning the not so innocent, because they were hysterical about things which, in his overwhelming self-absorption, he took for granted. It seems to communicate a lot of euphemism here. It's hard to say, but it seems like his ego is such that he doesn't have a lot of patience or affection for women because they always want something from him, like maybe love or respect or companionship or equality. And he's so self-absorbed, he's so prideful and selfish and convinced of his own destiny that he's unwilling to give them what they need, equality. But it says that his heart was in a constant turbulent riot. The most grotesque and fantastic conceits haunted him in his bed at night. We're starting to get into some cool words here. All right, so the whole time that he's working and he's meeting women and he's dating on and off and nothing satisfying him, his heart was in a riot, right? A little personification there that his heart is in a riot. The most grotesque and fantastic conceits haunted him in his bed at night. Let's go ahead and highlight grotesque. Grotesque simply means that it has sort of like a gross, twisted quality to it, but that also it's fascinating in a way. It's like when we look at statues, which are sort of gnarled and twisted and weird, but we want to like they're sort of draw our attention. And also fantastic, meaning fantasy conceits. The word conceit, we think oftentimes means like prideful, but that's not how it's being used here. A conceit is like a fantasy far beyond reality. Right? He's got his mind is going and racing about all the things he wants to do and all the things that he wants to be, and it haunts him on his bed at night. A universe of ineffable gaudiness spun itself out in his brain while the clock ticked on the washstand and the moon soaked with wet light his tangled clothes upon the floor. Again, some beautiful imagery here. Look, let's break it down. Ineffable means that it cannot be touched or spoken or made reality. Gaudiness means it's bright and it's flashy, almost too much, right? Neon, if you will. It spawns itself out in his brain and the clock ticks on the washstand. Another clock metaphor here. And the moon soaked with wet light upon his tangled clothes upon the floor. The moon and light are perceived through the means of our eyes, right? Vision. But it says that it's soaked with wet light. That doesn't make any sense, right? Light cannot have liquid to it, and it's soaked and it's wet. That's something we usually perceive through feels. And so, okay, the moon usually is a light, is seen, but we're feeling it with our senses. Aha, this is a mixture of two different sensory pieces of information. This is a synesthesia. And it says each night he added to the pattern of his fancies until drowsiness closed down upon some vivid scene with an oblivious embrace. He has fantasies till he falls asleep. And for a while, these reveries, these visions were provided an outlet for his imagination. They were a satisfactory hint of the unreality of reality. A little paradox there, the unreality of reality. A promise that the rock of the world was founded securely upon a fairy's wing, right? That the things which seem so solid and immovable and unshakable actually were very shakable if he just had enough willpower and belief in fantasy and belief in himself that he could make the solid things move with his mind or with his heart. This is someone that believes so strongly, has a vision of himself so strongly that he thinks that the world will bow and bend to it, will move itself out of the way, and that the world truly can be magical if you want it bad enough. This, on one hand, is very delusional. On the other hand, it is the thing, as Nick notes in chapter one, that makes Gatsby so fascinating. Most people believe in a fantasy up to a point, and then we kind of meet with reality and say, okay, let's temper our expectations here. Disappointment has a way of making us be a little bit more grounded, but Gatsby never learns from disappointment, never learns from reality, and instead just believes hard that he actually can do anything that he sets his mind to and be anything that he wants to become. And isn't truly that the promise of the American dream? But if he is the avatar or the messiah of the prophet of the American dream, and we see him as being delusional, perhaps Fitzgerald seems to be asking us, is our own belief in the American dream just as delusional and worthy of questioning? Come back for part two.